it gets to be even more of a challenge if you've ever, I've done it a couple times, you ever had to review an author's book in front of him or her. That's kind of intimidating as well. So I think he did an excellent job, but he always does an excellent job. And I'm very excited. I've been looking forward, with regard to Urban Engagement Book Club, I've been looking forward to this day all year because of the prospect at first, and then after we confirmed it, the fact that we're going to have with us two men that I admire greatly, and I consider to be friends. To my immediate left is Jim Schutz, who of course is the author of the book, columnist for the Dallas Observer. He's sometimes a nemesis of mine in between the Morning News and the Observer. Jim critiques sometimes softly and sometimes with a great deal of edge some of the columns that I write. But it's okay. I know where he's coming from, so I don't have a problem with it. And then to Jim's left is Reverend Peter Johnson. And Peter is a longtime friend of mine. I tell people, if you want to blame anybody for getting me into this aspect of social justice, then blame Peter Johnson. I volunteered / he drafted me into the SCLC here in Dallas, and I started out writing press releases and being the general secretary for SCLC here, and one other reporter, but in that work, one other reporter credited SCLC in a conversation with me of keeping alive the issue of single-member districts while the city council kept appealing a federal judge's ruling. And it was actually Peter and Adelpha Quejo, and I don't know who else, but who finally went to the Justice Department and got them to rule that single-member districts were going to have to be in Dallas. So I've known Peter since that time. He helped me learn what it meant to be a constructive troublemaker, and helped me also connect my personal story to that larger civil rights movement by introducing me to some of the civil rights leaders that we read about. So I'm glad to have them here with us. Let's give them a big hand. I just want to ask them a few questions, just kind of prime the pump, as it were, for your questions. And I know that you have a lot based that you've read the book, or if you haven't. But let me start with Jim first. Jim, one of the things I've been wanting to ask you, just never taken the time to, is I've heard, and maybe this is just rumor or gossip, I've heard that you said about the accommodation that if you had it to write all over again, you would write differently. A, what do you mean, and if that's true, and if it's true or not, what, how was the book received when it was first published?
Well, it's interesting first that you blame Peter, because I blame Peter for everything. For the fact that the book was never written in the first place, it was really Peter's idea. Okay. He went to a young editor at Taylor Publishing, Bobby Frazee, who was a guy who grew up in Birmingham, and Peter convinced him that the story of Dallas's past had to be told because Peter's experience had convinced him that Dallas just had a wrong version of the history. I wrote this book, it's when the excerpts were being read, I realized that I hate hearing it. It sounds now, the stories are like pornography. They're so ugly and depressing. We were talking a little bit before about if you were a black parent with a little kid, would you want your kid to hear this stuff or read one of the president's books? I wouldn't let a kid under 18 within 10 feet of this book because I think it's depressing, but I also think it's absolutely necessary, and Peter was right, that it had to be put on the page at some point. I do think that I came to it with a lot of Yankee carpetbagger naivete about what was going on in the city. And part of the reaction right after the book was published was that the only white person I knew of for sure who read it was my mother. She liked it a lot. Reverend Criswell said on the radio that he said it was pornography. And he used that word, and he said that members of the church were not to read it.
Wow. But you mean everybody rushed to read it?
Yeah. May have helped sales. It was to be published by Taylor Publishing. They, at the behest of the citizen of Alex Bickley, the Citizens Council, pulled it off the presses the day it was to run. And they did not print and publish it, and a guy in New Jersey who read about it published it and sent the books here. Anyway, that was a whole other story. In Black Dallas, and I got invited everywhere in Black Dallas after it came out, the reaction was sort of disappointing. Part of it was, we thought, we have been hearing about this book for 6 months, and we knew that the Citizens Council got it pulled, and we thought you were really gonna show where the bones are, where, you know, you were really gonna tell the truth. And instead, this is all stuff we've all known all along. There were no, you know, there were no surprises for black people who were politically involved at all. All this history was known, and worse. You know, I wrote about the bombings. The woman who was, I never found her when I was writing. There's this couple who were described here whose house was bombed. I never found them when I was writing the book. So after the book came out, she found me, and she came up to me after a thing, and she was very gracious and said she was glad that it was written. And then she told me the full story, and it was that she and her husband are in bed, the front of the house blows up, and there's just smoke and rubble, and she staggers forward through this rubble, and there's her husband with his leg torn halfway off. He's alive, and she's in shock, and she stumbles out of the front of the house, and here are all these blue lights. The police are there. The bomb just went off. And the police are ringing the house, and this police officer comes up and says, ma'am, is anybody hurt in there? And she said, yeah, my husband's got his leg broken off. And he said, well, we have an ambulance on the way, so everything's under control. And so she went back in the house, and she thought, they were here when the bomb went off. So, I mean, think how that would feel. So there was that response. There was another response I got some places, and maybe Peter can speak to this more than I can. There was a certain story that people would get up and tell in the comment part, where they say, oh yeah, here's this book by this white guy about how great integration was, how important integration was, and that there was a funny story that different people told, so I knew it was passed around, about the water fountains. All those years of segregation, there was the white water and the black water, and I thought, man, I would love to get some of that white water. That must be great stuff. And so then the signs came down, and I went over there and drank out of that fountain, and it was just water. And it was a funny story, but it had a message, which was this integration was a ripoff. And that we had our own entertainment neighborhoods, we had our own economy, we had things going, and that was all lost. You know, that all just eroded, and short North Dallas disappeared, and indeed it did. It's what we call uptown now.
Well, I think, and I think that's one of the things. When I read the book long ago, it's the first book that ever mentioned, that I read, that ever mentioned people that I actually knew, and places that I knew. I mean, the book starts off talking about the Blue Ribbon panel that was investigating the bombing, and it mentions Reverend R.L. Parrish, who was one of my grandfather's best friends, and on and on, places that you know, people that you know, and it's not surprising because you've got those inner stories that circulate throughout our community that aren't known to the larger, or at least kept quiet in the larger community.
There was a lot that was left out. I have a list of excuses for it, which I won't bore you with, but there were a lot of good people fighting on the right side. There was Rabbi Levi Olin.
Right.
There were other Methodist leaders. There were white folks doing the right thing during that time, and I think I gave them short shrift in the book by not getting to them. And I don't know if the book told effectively enough that in that atmosphere where people think the cops did the bombing, I don't know if the book got across the courage that it took to fight that regime anyway.
Peter, talk to us about your coming to Dallas.
Could I ask the speakers to stand at the podium? I'm craning my neck because
I can't hear.
We're here because, why don't you stand up and then you can still use it.
Well, here's
Put the microphone in your mouth.
Peter, why don't you talk about your coming to Dallas, and also I was talking to
Reverend is telling me to go over here.
He tells you go.
I've been married 40 years. I know how to take orders from women.
Talk to us about your coming to Dallas, and then talk to us too. I was talking to a group a couple of weeks ago about Fair Park and letting them know the connection between South Dallas and Fair Park, the spiritual connection, the connection of place between Fair Park and South Dallas.
First, good afternoon. I came to Dallas reluctantly, really against my will. I argued and argued. I was first told I was coming to Dallas in 1967, if I remember correctly. We were beginning to talk about the problems of the poor and poverty. Martin Luther King was talking about developing the Poor People's Campaign and identifying poverty, because Martin said poverty was an equal opportunity to offend the blacks, whites, browns, everybody that suffered from poverty. In 1969, after Dr. King's assassination, Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and a Jewish producer from Hollywood named Samuel Livingston decided to take Dr. King's life that was already on film and newsreels and etc. and develop a movie on Martin's story. It was entitled King Montgomery to Memphis. And the idea was we would take this movie around the world and try to raise enough money for Coretta and the children. Dr. King died without any insurance because no insurance company would sell life insurance to people like us at the time. So the idea was to try to fix it for Coretta and for the children. And the movie was going to premiere in 800 cities around the world. Andrew Young, who was my immediate boss at the time, decided that I should come to Dallas because Love Field was the best airport in the Southwest at that time. And I would have 5 southern states, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, and Louisiana, which is my home state. And I would have the cities in these states. The movie was going to premiere in October that year, 1969. So this, I came at, I think maybe I came in maybe July, August. When I came to Dallas, I found the people who was, I guess, my reception committee was the John Bright Society and the Minutemen. The threats was unbelievable. I can't begin to explain the threats when I first came here. My assignment was simple. We needed to raise a certain amount of money for Mrs. King and the children. So each staff member had a responsibility in their sector to raise X amount of dollars to help Dr. King's widow and the children. 800 cities, 799 cities in the world welcomed the movie on Martin Luther King's life. There was only one city on earth that rejected the movie on Martin Luther King's life. We live in that city. Here. This was the only city. Being the youngest man on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff, there was always friction, first between me and the older men, and then me and my contemporaries who was all older than me. Jesse Jackson and Julian Bond and John Lewis and Eddie Osborne, all these fellows were a little older than me. So there was a little conflict because they was always saying, well, y'all let Peter do stuff you don't let nobody else do. Peter's too young, shouldn't let him do this. We can't trust him because he's too volatile. So the idea of me getting this big project created conflict inside of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with me and the senior men who did not trust me because I could come down here and just create all kinds of havoc. And then my contemporaries who were saying, well, you know, you shouldn't let him do this because, so the idea of not raising my share of the money was something I had to, I couldn't go back to Atlanta and not have, because I was going to hear, well, we told you don't let Peter Johnson, he's too young, you should. So Dallas became, for me, something that I had to figure out how to overcome. And we fought with the power structures here. Now, I called them the White Citizens Council. And that's what they were, and they hated the fact that that's how I referred to them. They were the White Citizens Council. The difference between them and the Ku Klux Klan was attire. The Klan wore their bedclothes. These men wore sheets. And these men wore $500 suits. That was the only difference between them. They didn't call you nigger. They called it the Negro community. So trying to figure out how to get the movie to be successful here and not get involved in a bit of conflict with the power structure. These people from the Fowl Park homeowners kept coming to my hotel asking for help. Elsa Faye Higgins and J.B. Jackson and Albert Lipscomb and Mr. Gideon Johnson. I guess everybody's dead now. Mr. Gideon Johnson shook his finger in my face one night and told me if Martin Luther King was alive, he would help us. And I was trying to explain to them I can't get involved in local stuff. I have a national responsibility, and I've been ordered not to get involved in no fights in Texas. There was a kind of anger with the senior men in the civil rights movement toward this community, because this is the only community in America where the black community boycotted Martin Luther King when he came here to speak. So Ralph Abernathy and Andrew Young and Thurgood Marshall and Roy Wilkins, these men were angry with blacks in this part of the country. And Andy's thing to me was, Peter, we don't want to do nothing to help the black community in Dallas. Do your assignment and come on back to Atlanta. Don't get in any fights in Dallas. And these people kept coming to the hotel room telling me why the Southern Christian Leadership Conference should help them. And my focus was on making sure the movie would be successful here so I could raise my amount of money that I was committed to raise. Once the movie was over, and it was very successful here, thank God we was able to meet our quota, I had made up my mind, even if SCLC would fire me, we needed to help the Fowl Park homeowners. And Dallas has a history of disrespect for black property owners. They have made the black community nomads. One community here, they would take their land and move them over here. 10, 20 years later, they would want this land and move them over here. So I knew that this is something that Mr. Gideon Johnson was right about. This is something that Martin was alive, we would help these people. So that's basically, once the movie was a success, I requested to be able to spend 90 more days here to help the Fowl Park homeowners. My boss, who was Andrew Young, said, no, Peter, come back to Dallas. Come back to Atlanta. And of course, I was 23 years old and not only disrespectful with Andy and Drum Abernathy and those men, I was convinced I had more sense than them. Didn't know why they would let me tell them what to do. So I decided to stay. And of course, Andy fired me. And I found out I was fired. I was listening to the black radio station, and there was a bulletin came on and said, and Reverend Andrew Young had fired Peter Johnson. It was news to me. Mrs. King made Andy hire me back. And because I appealed to Coretta and explained to Mrs. King that we need to help these people. Listen, we are not turning our backs on these people. We have to figure out a way to help them. So Coretta forced Andy and Abernathy to hire me back and told me I could be here for 6 months. That's when we took on the Fowl Park homeowners fight, and it was in the middle of December. and I was meeting with Fair Park homeowners and trying to convince them about nonviolent protests. What we had been doing in the rest of the South was foreign to the black community here. You know, in the rest of the South, we primarily had the churches. We didn't have the churches here. In fact, other than your daddy, no other church would allow us in that church. And there was one church in South Dallas, which is Martin Luther King now, which is Forest Avenue. It was a Lutheran church pastored by Mark Herbner, a white German Lutheran. Mark was probably the most militant black preacher in South Dallas. So we could use his church. We were training the Fair Park homeowners, who was primarily senior citizens, in the ordeal of nonviolent confrontation. And the idea was to train enough people that we could force the mayor, who would say he would never meet with the Negroes, that we could at least force him to sit down and talk to these people whose arms they were taking. Because of the Kennedy assassination here, Dallas was very, very sensitive to its national image. And I knew that the Cotton Bowl was coming. And that this was something they couldn't cancel. So we waited until New Year's Eve, which was, I think, December the 31st, and we met in the basement of Mark Herbner's church. And at that time, in the civil rights movement, the young people, we had a kind of a creed and a commitment to each other, in spite of what the older men would tell us what we could not do. And I had sent what was called mailograms around the nation to our friends, telling them to come to Dallas and go to jail with me on January the 1st of New Year's Day. So they poured into Dallas, literally from all over, from Florida, West California, North Carolina, blacks and whites, from the anti-war movement and from the civil rights movement. So all my friends came with their backpacks and their sleeping bags to come to Dallas and protest. So we had enough people here. If we needed to do this, we could have done it with people who knew about nonviolent protest. But Ralph Abernathy had told me, don't do that. You must not endanger the lives of those old people. Do not get those people bloody. So we were really bluffing, because I know in the world I could have done that. But I thought that if we bluffed them, we could force them to meet. And in that church that night, we was constantly getting threats that the church was going to be bombed. My friend Sam Donaldson, because the national press was here for the Cotton Bowl, so we had the national press in the basement of the church, so the world was seeing what we were doing. Eric Johnson, who was the mayor, I guess about 11:15, we got a call from Frank Dyson, who was the chief of police, saying the mayor has agreed to meet with you all, if you all will meet. And of course, we had the Fair Park homeowners to choose their leaders. They chose Albert Lipscomb, who's passed on, J.B. Jackson, and Elsa Faye Higgins. And we went downtown to meet with the mayor at Republic Bank building. And I counseled those leaders before they, I said, before you go in, first look him in his eyes and tell him that the city is taking your homes, not houses, but your homes. Then the other thing, tell him that unless the Cotton Bowl parade is integrated tomorrow, we're going to block it. So that next day when the Cotton Bowl parade came down the street, Sam Donaldson was laughing, saying, and leading the parade is Mayor Eric Johnson in a nice convertible Cadillac, and I don't know who that Negro man is sitting next to me. So basically that's how that fight started. We knew because we had been involved in fights regarding eminent domain in other parts of the South, primarily Tennessee with Baker versus Carter, that eminent domain was absolute. You wasn't going to win the legal fight with eminent domain. But we thought there were other issues involved in that, the issue of fair market value for property. And the research that we had gotten our friends at the Wharton School of Business out of Pennsylvania to come down here and help us, professors with PhDs in urban planning and land use. And so the professors had basically said, the issue, Peter, is fair market value. You have a piece of property, let's say you had 2801 4th Avenue. This is a black family that owns that little home. This property, by the city's evaluation, is worth 50 cents a square foot. At 2803, right next door, there's a black family who's renting from a slumlord who lives in Highland Park. His property is worth $2.50 a square foot. So we knew we had them. We knew we had them in federal court. All we needed to do was to get in federal court. Well, we couldn't win them in a domain, but we could force them to pay fair market value to black property owners and relocation fees, and we could also embarrass them on the bigotry and deciding that black property was less valuable than white-owned property. So we kind of had it. So that's kind of the story of how we decided to pick a fight down here in Texas.
Gerald,
Yeah.
one quick thing. When you talked about no black churches, W.T. White wouldn't allow black employees to go to any meeting, this is in the book, where the NAACP was mentioned. And Zan Holmes was in a middle of a sermon, and he mentioned the NAACP, and somebody yelled out from the pews, "You can't say that, or we'll have to leave, or we'll be fired." So that's the kind of control.
The black church, the word we used in the South was the black church has been co-opted by the white power structure. We were not angry with the black churches because we knew it was not their fault that they had been co-opted and they was under the thumb. In other words, the first time we brought Jesse Jackson to town, he was going to speak at Warren United Methodist Church. The Citizen Charter Association got the bank to call a note on the church. Yeah? And we talk about playing dirty, you know, Reverend Morley, who's dead now, J.D. Morley was, you know, he was in tears. He said, "Peter, they're going to call a note on my church. What am I going to do? Unless I not let you, if y'all come to this church, we're going to lose the church." And so the church, the black church here was being intimidated, terrorized, and of course, if the church got out of line, they would call the church's note. So don't be angry with the black churches here. It was not that they did not want to work with us, it's because they was under that kind of a reality.
We just did a documentary screening of the Revisionaries last week and had Mavis Knight, who is on the school board, the state school board with us, and we asked her about the experience portrayed in the movie, and she said it was far worse. So when you read the Accommodation and you read those stories in there, I think you can get a picture both from Jim and from Peter that it was far worse than what's depicted in the book. Good question for y'all. I've got a story about Peter getting me involved in a nonviolent protest, and I'll hold it for you all till you all get your questions. Questions for Peter, questions for Jim.
Not all at once, and no math questions.
Brad?
Jim, I wonder, have you talked to any white people, you know, a decade or two later about how they felt about how the actual people who were involved in it and whether or not they look back on that with regret?
I've talked to a lot of white people who moved here since or were born here since then. And some of whom have read the book and they said it was interesting and they thought it explained some things. But in the generation that would be my generation, maybe I don't get around enough, but I don't find much change. Sorry to say.
Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, speaking of not much change, you're talking about the way people feel who, you know, there, then I would be interested for all three of you to comment on how you think other things have changed. Like, you know, where are we in our balance of power and how much accommodation is still going on? I just think it seems to be like a lot. So, you know, where are we now compared to when the accommodation happened? And
I'll let them answer, and if anything comes to mind, I'll say it. But
Let me go first and then Peter can correct me. If I back away from all the political stuff and just look out, it's completely changed. When I came here in 1978, the city was segregated downtown. There wasn't an active black middle class downtown. It's completely different. If I go out to the suburbs, it's like MLK's dream, except it's economically stratified. But it's diverse, not just black, white, but black, white, Hispanic, immigrant, Asian, everything. It just wasn't that way in '78. So politically, Dallas proper is maybe stuck in the past in a lot of ways. But demographically, as far as people's lives are concerned, I think it's completely different and much for the better.
There's no doubt about it that we have come almost full circle regarding changes, not just in this part of the country, but in our nation. Dallas was probably the most segregated city I visited. I worked all over the South in every southern state. Dallas was unbelievable and very conservative and very arrogant in its racism. So there's no doubt about it that we've made great strides and great changes. But if you consider Martin Luther King's last great challenge was to address the problems of poverty. Yeah. We have gotten worse than we were 50 years ago. When I look at South Dallas and West Dallas and Pleasant Grove, where the median income family of four is less than $14,000 a year, and there's a direct relationship between crime and poverty. There's a direct relationship between dope dealing in South Dallas in $14,000 a year for a family of four. So to understand that the civil rights movement was not just about removing the colored and white signs and being able to ride at the front of the bus, it was also about changing the quality of life for people of color. And no, we have not done that. See, the vast amount of our people is still trapped in a long midnight of poverty.
And I think that's what I say too, that poverty persists, and it is most, its impact is most devastating on minorities, because when you add the legacy of racism to the fact of poverty, the impact is devastating. And I think that we live in a climate now that is cultural and political, if you can separate out the two. We live in a climate now where I would say sometimes I read the comments from at the end of Jim's article, where the idea is projected that black people are just dark white people who don't try hard enough, and does not take into account the systemic and the institutional racism that tends to depress opportunity and access in low-income and predominantly minority communities. So that's the difference now. When it comes to the obvious barriers, then of course it's different. All of our lives are different. We haven't caught on to the fact that if we continue to remove barriers, all of our lives will continue to be made different for the better. And that's the thing we have to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to put any kind of a happy face on anything. This is always difficult for me to come to these talks and face reality, but I try to. But this is pretty hard to hear, frankly. Not that it's new, but it's still hard. I know it. I just want to say that, but I do want to ask you. I try to tell my son, who's 27, I guess now, that we didn't do a good job in what we had to do as adults in terms of making the world a better place. And I'm hopeful that he will have learned from us, his mother and I, and our church community here, that people are equal, and that we should love our neighbor, and we should take Jesus' words seriously. And I sense in him a better ability to treat people fairly than my parents did. Do you see progress in young people? I'm not trying to put a happy face on everything, because I know we got a long way to go. But do you sense the same incremental change?
I have a son who's 26. When he was a student at Woodrow, he came home, and my wife and I consider ourselves A+++ liberals. we should get a perfect score. And he came home with a bunch of guys from high school, and there was a kid we didn't recognize who was African American. And so I said, "Who's that guy?" And he said, "I don't know, he's Tom." And I said, "Oh, really? Where does Tom live?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, what's he like? And my son stopped and he said, you guys never ask me these questions about white kids. And that was the beginning of my realization that, yeah, his whole generation is a big bump up from people my age, conservative or liberal.
My youngest child is 30 years old, my little girl, my daughter. And of course, her generation, they've never seen the color of the white sign. She's always had Anglo friends, Hispanic friends, Asian friends. Growing up, a bunch of giggling little girls spending the pajama party together. Their generation, first, they don't have time for race. That is so far from, if you talk to a kid 30 years old, whether they're black, white, or Hispanic, race has no real meaning to them. You know what my daughter said, "Daddy, that was the olden days." So I have great faith in that generation and in their children, because they see people as people. That does not mean that we must not struggle with the realities of yesterday, because in order for us to have a better tomorrow, we've got to deal with the realities of yesterday. But I have a tremendous amount of faith in that generation. They never went to a segregated school. They've always had each other. So it's a different kind of perspective for them when it comes to America's race.
Anyway. Jerry, sorry.
I read your book last week, and it was very helpful on the background. Now, I'd like to ask a question of like updating. 40 years ago, I had a very creative group of college students, and they wanted to study. They studied at Austin College, not in Dallas, whether the busing issue, the solution that was proposed by the high-tech community, was two-way interactive television as a way of bringing people together. It didn't work. We had a big grant, and we discovered that Dallas didn't want to hear of this. Austin did. Washington did. Was that ever an issue? And then how do you see school integration today?
Well, I can tell you where I see it, and from a different perspective than Peter and Jim, because one of the things that Jim does mention, which I had also had never read before until I read his book, was the history of Hamilton Park. And our integration, or the desegregation of Hamilton Park School, a school, happened, if I'm not mistaken, a year before Dallas schools were integrated. So that was when I was in the 8th grade, so whatever year that was. DISD was desegregated after that. Whatever year that was some 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education. And what Dallas had been doing from 1954 to 1970 or so was trying to figure out every way it could to avoid desegregating. As a matter of fact, I think it's in your book where it says that the Supreme Court ruling says that it was supposed to be done with all deliberate speed, and I think Jim says in his book that it was done with all deliberate lethargy. So that's how it happened here in Dallas.
Yeah, there's a difficult piece of that history, which was that the lawyers for the plaintiffs in the later deseg, I think it was Coalition to Maximize Education, lawyers were Ed Kloppman and Betsy Julian, if I remember. And they were fighting for straight up full-fledged busing, and may still have been fighting for cross-district busing. And their clients, the coalition, the African-American plaintiffs, went behind their backs to the lawyer for the district. I'm not thinking of his name.
Is it Bigley?
No, it was the guy who was representing the district.
Bob Thomas later represented.
Bob Thomas. And cut a deal, which was, we don't want full-fledged busing. We want instead these centers where we're going to put special investment into black schools. But they basically said, we really don't want our kids going to school with those white people's kids. And so the final solution was actually one that tilted back toward segregation. I think there's an unresolved piece there that we're still working on.
I think in order to understand Jim's observations with black parents here, you have to look at what was going on inside the struggle for school integration in the civil rights movement. From my perspective as a young man, the things that we was observing and objecting to was, first, I knew Ernie Green in the Little Rock Nine, and I know what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I don't remember a young lady in Grenada, Mississippi, who was the first African-American child to integrate to schools in Grenada, Mississippi. But throughout the Southwest, we had personal relationships with these families. The kind of hostile situation that we was putting little children in, I totally disagreed with. I thought it was unfair to take a 10-year-old little child and put him in that kind of mean-spirited, potentially violent, angry, hostile situation. Martin, Dr. King, and Reverend Abernathy, and Thurgood Marshall, these men felt that this is suffering that we must face. This is stuff that we have to go through. That we can't get around this. In order for us to move forward, we're going to have to force our way into white schools and do well in white schools. The pain and the suffering that the Little Rock Nine went through, or that little girl from Grenada, Mississippi, or the kids in New Orleans, throughout the South, I thought it was unfair that because there were children, I was a college kid at the time, but we were talking about high school and elementary children being put into these mean-spirited, hostile situations. So by the time desegregation got to this part of the country, black parents had saw what took place in Mississippi and in Arkansas and in Alabama. So they were saying, I don't know if I want my baby to be in the white school. White people is mean. You know? So those of us who saw it from the inside kind of understood the reluctance of black parents to subject their children to the realities of integrating schools.
And could I have sent my kid? I doubt it. But there's another shoe to fall, which is that segregation doesn't work. That whole thing of enriching black schools so that the kids could have a better education there, it just doesn't work because it's segregation. Anyway.
And there's a conundrum, because now we have really de facto segregation.
Let that bald-headed white man talk.
Yeah.
Speaking of recurring themes and no change, it's a long way from Duncanville to the Lakewood Library. But the recurring answer, no change, is what I continue to get year after year from half-price books when I call trying to find a copy of the Accommodation. Which obviously leads me to the next question, is if you give any thought to another printing, as is, but then perhaps with your updates, yeah.
The rights to the book belong to Dallas County Commissioner John Wiley Price. This happened some years back when Commissioner Price and I were still conversant. He asked me why I didn't republish the book. I said because there's no money in it. Nobody will do it. It costs too much to print it, and you lose a bunch of money. Commissioner Price said, well, I'll republish it, and we'll have the benefits go to Kwanzaa Fest. And I said, great, good luck. And I gave him a letter saying, the rights are yours forever. See what you can do with it. A year later, I called him up and said, well, I thought you were going to republish the book. And he said, that book is a loser, man. I can't. I said, I'm not going to republish that. I'd lose all kinds of money. Because he'd gone out into the publishing world and found out what was involved. And I laughed, and then I forgot to ask him to sign the rights back to me, and now I would have to get him to answer the phone in order to get the rights back. So it's sort of stuck somewhere.
It sounds like an opportunity.
Yeah.
For somebody. All right.
Let me say something about this gentleman who asked that hard question. William Harris, I call him Wild Bill. Bill worked for LBJ and the LBJ White House. I just love him to death. I mean, he earned the name Wild Bill, believe me, he earned that. One of the most decent Christian men I've ever worked with and ever known. He also worked for H.L. Hunt. Now think about this. Lyndon Johnson and H.L. Hunt.
And he came out of it.
Yeah.
Don't forget Dr. Christmas and First Baptist.
Yeah.
Listen, my quick story about Peter and my baptism into nonviolent protest. When we were protesting the city council's continued appeal of the federal judge's ruling, Peter decided it was time to dramatically demonstrate the fact that this was representation, taxation without representation. And so he called the president of SCLC and told him about this idea he had. And the president called me and said, Gerald, have you talked to Peter? And I said, not since earlier today. And he said, Peter wants to dump cases of African-American coffee in the fountain in front of City Hall and let it be our own kind of tea party.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
And the president didn't want to, we were of a different generation. The president didn't want to get arrested. I didn't mind getting arrested for the protest, but I had some speeding tickets out. So all I could do is see them bailing me out for the protest, but then say, well, he's got tickets, so he's going to stay in there and sit those out. So I called Peter up, and I told him, I said, Peter, and then he told me his idea. And I said, Peter, let's not dump all the cases in there. And he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, how about a can? And so we got a can of African-American coffee, of the African coffee, and on the front page of the Dallas Morning News, Dallas Times Herald at that time, there was a picture of me, Peter, and the president of SCLC pouring African coffee into the pool in front of City Hall. Now, the kicker came after the next day when I was talking to my father, and he said, what on earth are you doing? And I had to lay it all out to him. So that was my baptism into that. All right.
Ready?
Ready.
Gerald, did you ever get those speeding tickets taken care of?
I eventually did, yes. Not that.
I don't get to do this ever, but Mr. Johnson, who I did not know until today, Mr. Johnson and Gerald Britt and Larry James, who was working in this arena in his earliest years in New Orleans, and Jim Schutz, who has been writing with the same voice. You know, there's a line that says, the essential thing in heaven on earth is that there be long obedience in the same direction. These people have done it. Let's give them a hand. We have done books on the Little Rock Central High School, the Little Rock 9. We have done other books on racism. We have done books on poverty. We would love to have more people come to this event because I think this sparks conversations that are valuable. Next month, we're doing the Coming Jobs War, which is the #1 problem in America and the world. There are not enough jobs. This is written by Jim Clifton, who is the chairman of Gallup. If you've got ticket number
541.
Last 3 digits, 541. Anybody got 541? You get the free book. And we will meet in this room on the 3rd Thursday of November. Well, are we meeting on the 3rd Thursday of November? That doesn't hit Thanksgiving, does it? So we're okay. We thank you all for coming, and Mr. Johnson, Mr. Schutz, Mr. Britt, what a great, great day.